On the morning of March 20th, 2025, the golden rays of a crisp spring sun filtered through the towering windows of Trump Tower, casting warm streaks of light across the marble floors. The city of New York buzzed below with its usual rhythm: honking taxis, bustling pedestrians, and a sense of timeless urgency. But for Barron Trump, the day felt different. It was his 19th birthday, a milestone that should have been filled with celebrations and fanfare. Yet, instead of the lavish parties he had grown accustomed to, his mind was elsewhere, caught on a thought he couldn't shake. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Barron scrolled through an old photo album on his phone. He paused at a picture he had seen many times before: a newborn version of himself, swaddled in a soft white blanket, cradled in the arms of a woman in a crisp white nurse's uniform. Her face, though partially hidden by a surgical mask, held a warmth that seemed to radiate through the image. His mother, Melania Trump, stood beside her, exhausted but smiling softly. He had asked his mother about that day once before. Who was she? He had questioned, pointing to the nurse. Melania had smiled fondly, recalling how the woman had comforted her through the long hours of labor and had been the first person to hold Barron outside the family. Yet, neither she nor his father had kept in touch with her. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Barron felt a deep tug in his heart. Perhaps it was because the world saw him only as the son of a president, the towering figure who had grown up under the brightest of spotlights. But the woman in that picture had met him before all of that, before he was a public figure, before his life became a topic for tabloids. She had held him when he was simply a baby, a tiny human with no expectations placed upon him. That thought stirred something profound inside him. He needed to find her. Downstairs, the Trumps had gathered for a private birthday breakfast. His father, Donald Trump, now in his third term as President of the United States, was reviewing some documents while sipping black coffee. Across the table, Melania adjusted her pearls, noticing the faraway look in her son's eyes. "You're quiet this morning," she said gently, her accent still rich after all these years. Barron hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mom, do you remember the nurse who delivered me?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. Melania raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Yes, I do," she replied, setting her fork down. "She was kind. Someone I'll never forget." "Why do you ask?" "I want to find her," Barron confessed, the words spilling out faster than he had planned. I don't know why. I just feel like I need to see her. Thank her." The room fell into a moment of silence. His father, usually quick to speak his mind, studied him with an unreadable expression. Finally, Donald Trump nodded slowly. "If that's what you want, son, do it," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You're old enough to follow your heart." Melania's face softened into a smile. "I think that's a wonderful idea." And with that, the decision was made. Barron Trump, heir to a legacy of wealth and power, was about to embark on a journey of the heart, one that no amount of privilege could prepare him for. Within an hour, he was dressed in a tailored navy coat, ready to face the bustling streets of Manhattan. As his black SUV pulled away from the gilded doors of Trump Tower, Barron couldn't help but wonder, what would she be like now? Was she still working? Did she even remember him? But deep down, he knew one thing for sure: he had to find out. The black SUV weaved through Manhattan's busy streets, the hum of the city filling the air. Barron sat in the back seat, his thoughts tangled with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. How do you find someone from nearly 2 decades ago in a city of over 8 million people? His first stop was the New York Presbyterian Hospital, where he knew he had been born. As the vehicle pulled up in front of the sprawling medical complex, Barron felt a jolt of nervousness. Would they even help him? Or would the sight of Donald Trump's son trigger nothing more than media interest? He stepped out, adjusting his coat against the crisp spring breeze. Flanked by his Secret Service detail, Barron made his way through the revolving doors. The sterile scent of disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from a nearby cafe. At the information desk, an older woman with silver hair and reading glasses glanced up from her computer. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition but softened into a polite smile. "Good morning, Mr. Trump. How may I assist you?" Barron cleared his throat, trying to push aside the awkwardness. "I'm looking for a nurse who worked here 19 years ago on March 20th, 2006. She was there when I was born." The woman's brows knitted together as she tapped on her keyboard. We keep staff records, but for privacy reasons, I can't share them easily. Do you have a name? Barron shook his head, frustration creeping in. No, I only have a photo. He pulled out his phone and handed it to her, showing the faded image of the nurse holding him. The receptionist's expression softened as she studied the picture. You know, she said, her voice warm, there aren't many nurses who stay with a patient during the entire delivery. That kind of care? It's personal. Let me check with some of our long-time staff. While she made calls, Barron wandered to the hospital's maternity ward, where his life had begun. He peeked through the nursery window, where tiny newborns wriggled in their bassinets. He tried to picture himself there, before the press, before the politics, before the expectations. Just a baby. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Trump. He turned to see the receptionist approaching. I may have a lead. There's a nurse who worked here for 30 years. Margaret Collins. She retired a few years ago, but she was known for staying with mothers during labor. It sounds like her. Barron's heart skipped a beat. Do you know how I can reach her? I'm afraid I can't give out personal information, the receptionist said apologetically, then leaned in closer with a conspiratorial smile. But she volunteers at St. Mary's Community Clinic on Wednesdays. You might find her there. It was a long shot, but it was something. Thank you, Barron said, genuine gratitude filling his voice. As the SUV pulled away from the hospital, his mind raced. Why was this so important to him? Maybe because it felt real, more real than the life most people assumed he lived. At St. Mary's Community Clinic, the atmosphere was different, warmer, less polished. The modest brick building stood tucked between high rises, a reminder that parts of New York still clung to their humanity. Inside, the scent of antiseptic mixed with the faint smell of fresh flowers. Barron approached the front desk, his pulse quickening. I'm looking for Margaret Collins. Is she here today? The young receptionist blinked in surprise, recognizing him immediately. Nurse Collins is in the back helping with checkups. Let me see if she's free. Barron took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had faced cameras and crowds all his life, but this felt more personal, more vulnerable. A few minutes later, the door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. Her hair was silver now, cut short in soft waves. Deep laugh lines framed her face, but her eyes, gentle and kind, were exactly as he remembered from the photograph. And in that instant, he knew. Mrs. Collins? He asked softly. She tilted her head, studying him curiously. Yes, dear. I think you were there when I was born, Barron said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm Barron Trump. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. Then her eyes widened with recognition, and something else, something deeper. My goodness, she breathed, bringing a hand to her heart. I remember you. For a moment, the noise of the clinic seemed to fade into the background. Barron stood face to face with Margaret Collins, the woman who had held him in his first fragile moments. The warmth in her eyes softened the sharp edges of his anxiety, and in her presence, he felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of belonging. You really remember me? Barron asked, his voice wavering slightly. Margaret smiled gently, stepping closer. Of course I do, she said. Your mother was so poised, but I could tell she was nervous. And you, her gaze softened further. You were the quietest little thing. Barely even cried. Most newborns come into this world screaming their lungs out, but you just looked around like you were already figuring everything out. Barron let out a quiet laugh, his shoulders relaxing. I guess not much has changed, he murmured. Margaret chuckled softly. I held you while your mother rested. I remember thinking how rare it was, this little baby born into the spotlight, but still so fragile. So innocent. She paused, a touch of wonder in her voice. And now here you are, all grown up. Barron swallowed the knot in his throat. He had spent his whole life being known for who he was, not what he felt. Yet, in that moment, he wasn't the son of a billionaire or the president. He was just Barron, a young man trying to connect to something deeper. I don't know why I needed to find you, he admitted quietly. I saw your picture holding me and I couldn't stop thinking about you. About that moment. I wanted to say thank you for being there when I first came into the world. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She reached out and gently took his hand in hers. You have no idea what this means to me, she whispered. Most babies I deliver, I never see again. to know you thought of me after all these years? It's a gift I never expected." The emotion in the air hung heavy between them, a connection that transcended the years. For Barron, it was the first time in a long while that someone saw him not for what he represented, but for who he truly was. A soft knock at the clinic door interrupted their moment. One of the volunteers peeked in. "Mrs. Collins, we have another patient," she said apologetically. Margaret squeezed his hand before letting go. Would you wait for me?" she asked hesitantly. Barron smiled. "Of course. I'm not leaving without hearing more." He found a seat in the small waiting area while Margaret returned to her work. As he sat there, watching people come and go, Barron reflected on the weight of his decision to seek her out. It wasn't just about finding the woman who delivered him, it was about finding himself in a world that often decided who he should be. About an hour later, Margaret returned, her steps lighter, as if their reunion had given her a new energy. "I'm done for the day," she said, removing her lab coat. "Would you like to take a walk with me? I'd love to hear more about your life." He nodded eagerly, grateful for the opportunity to extend their time together. As they stepped out onto the bustling streets of Manhattan, Barron realized this was the best birthday gift he could have given himself. A connection to his beginning. They strolled through Central Park, the cool spring breeze brushing against their faces. Margaret shared stories about her decades as a nurse, how she had delivered over 5,000 babies during her career, each one a unique miracle in its own way. "But you," she said with a smile, "you always stood out, not because of who your father was, but because of how peaceful you seemed. Even back then, there was something different about you." Barron felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest. All his life, he had been under the public eye, expected to live up to an image crafted by the media. Yet here was someone who had known him at his most vulnerable, who remembered him not for his fame but for the quiet soul he had always been. "I needed this," he confessed softly as they paused near a blooming cherry blossom tree. "I didn't realize how much until now. Thank you for everything." Margaret reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead like a grandmother would. "You've grown into a fine young man," she said warmly. "And don't let anyone tell you who you should be. You get to decide that for yourself." Her words struck something deep inside him, an affirmation he had longed for without realizing it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Barron knew their meeting wasn't the end. This was the start of something. A new chapter where he wasn't defined by his last name but by the connections he chose to cherish. Before they parted ways, he pulled out his phone. "Can we take a picture together?" he asked. "I want to remember today." Margaret's smile lit up her face. "I'd love that." As the camera clicked, capturing the unlikely pair against the backdrop of a blooming Manhattan, Barron knew this moment would stay with him forever. A reminder that, no matter how far life takes you, sometimes the most profound journeys are the ones that lead you back to where it all began. The next morning, the soft hum of New York City waking up filled the air as sunlight streamed through the windows of Trump Tower. Barron sat at the dining table, absent-mindedly stirring his coffee. His thoughts lingered on Margaret Collins, the nurse who had held him during his first breath and now, 19 years later, had given him something he hadn't realized he needed, a sense of grounding. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "Thank you for yesterday, Barron. It meant the world to me. Margaret." A smile crept across his face. He saved her number immediately. Over the years, he had met countless public figures, world leaders, business moguls, celebrities, but meeting Margaret felt different. It was simple, genuine. She had no agenda, no expectations, just warmth and kindness. Later that day, as the Secret Service SUV glided through the familiar streets of Fifth Avenue, Barron found himself longing to learn more about her. He hadn't expected one meeting to stir so much inside him, but it had. After a moment's hesitation, he dialed her number. "Hello?" Margaret's warm voice came through the line, steady and familiar. "Hi, Mrs. Collins." "It's Barron," he said, his voice softer than usual. I was wondering, would you like to join me for lunch? There's still so much I'd love to hear about your life." A soft chuckle echoed through the phone. "You know, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon," she teased gently. "But yes, I'd love that." An hour later, Barron waited at the Plaza Hotel's iconic palm court, the crystal chandeliers glimmering above him. When Margaret arrived, her modest gray coat and simple pearl earrings stood out against the opulence of the room, but to Barron, she fit in perfectly. You know, you didn't have to go to all this trouble, she said, settling into the plush chair across from him. It's not trouble, Barron insisted. Honestly, I wanted to see you again. As their conversation unfolded, Barron learned things he hadn't expected. Margaret had dedicated over 30 years to nursing but had retired just after the pandemic to care for her ailing husband. Since his passing, she had thrown herself into volunteering. It gives me purpose, she explained softly. When my husband passed, I felt lost. But giving my time to others? It fills the emptiness. Life can feel so fleeting, I've learned that firsthand. Her words struck a chord deep within Barron. For all the privilege and power in his life, loneliness still found a way to creep in. I know what you mean, he admitted. People assume my life is perfect because of who my father is. But it's not always easy being seen as a reflection of someone else. Margaret gave him a knowing smile. That's the thing about life, it's yours. No matter who your father is, you get to decide what kind of man you want to become. Her words hung in the air, more profound than she likely realized. For the first time, Barron felt like someone understood the weight he carried. They lingered over lunch for hours, sharing stories, Margaret about the babies she delivered and the lessons of loss and healing, Barron about the complexities of growing up under the watchful gaze of the world. Before parting ways, Barron reached across the table and gently held her hand. I don't want to lose touch again, he said earnestly. You've given me something I didn't know I was missing. I want you to be part of my life if you're willing. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she squeezed his hand in return. You have no idea how much that means to me, she whispered. As Barron stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, his heart felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. He had come to find a piece of his past, but in doing so he had found something even more precious, a bond that transcended time and status. And for the first time in a long while, Barron Trump felt truly seen. The days after his meeting with Margaret Collins felt different, lighter, fuller. For the first time in his 19 years, Barron Trump felt connected to something beyond the carefully crafted world of politics and privilege. He found himself texting Margaret often, sharing pieces of his life he rarely voiced aloud. She, in return, shared stories of the families she had helped, the heartaches she had faced, and the simple joys that still made her smile. Their friendship, unlikely as it was, became a source of quiet comfort. One afternoon, while reviewing college applications at Trump Tower, his phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. I'm helping at the community baby shower this weekend. Would you like to come? No cameras, just kindness. Barron smiled to himself. There was something refreshing about being invited somewhere not because of his last name, but because someone genuinely wanted his presence. He responded quickly. I'll be there. When Saturday arrived, Barron left behind the sleek black SUVs and slipped into a modest sedan with just one security agent. The event was held at a small community center in the Bronx, a world away from the marble floors and gilded ceilings he knew. Inside, the room buzzed with warmth and laughter. Young mothers, many struggling to make ends meet, sorted through donated baby clothes while volunteers handed out diapers and formula. The scent of fresh-baked cookies lingered in the air. Barron. Margaret's face lit up as he entered. She waved him over to a long table stacked with gift bags. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I wouldn't miss it, he said, rolling up his sleeves. Put me to work. 4 hours, Barron packed bags, handed out baby blankets, and even assembled cribs alongside the other volunteers. There were no flashing cameras, no reporters, just human connection. At one point, a young mother cradling a newborn approached him hesitantly. Are you the president's son? She asked softly. Barron smiled, nodding. Yeah. But today I'm just Barron. She laughed, shifting her baby in her arms. Well, Barron, thank you for being here. It means a lot to us. By the time the event ended, his heart felt fuller than it had in years. As the last of the volunteers cleaned up, Barron stood beside Margaret, watching the sun dip below the skyline. I get it now, he said quietly. Why you do this? It feels real. Margaret turned to him, pride gleaming in her eyes. Real connections are what life is all about, she said. And you're just getting started. You have the power to do so much good, Barron. Don't ever forget that. Her words stayed with him long after they parted ways. That night, as he lay in bed, he realized that meeting Margaret had changed him in ways he couldn't quite explain. For years, the world had told him who he was supposed to be, the heir to a political dynasty, a public figure destined for scrutiny. But Margaret had reminded him that he was more than a name. He was a person capable of kindness, compassion, and choice. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived on Margaret's doorstep. Inside, she found a handwritten letter from Barron. Dear Mrs. Collins, I wanted to thank you again, not just for being there when I was born, but for reminding me who I want to be. Meeting you changed the way I see the world. I want to be someone who helps others the way you do. I've made a decision. I'm launching a foundation to support maternal care and community health, especially for mothers who don't always get the help they need. I'd like you to be part of it. Your kindness changed my life. Let's work together to change even more. With gratitude, Barron. Tears pricked Margaret's eyes as she read the letter. She had spent decades caring for strangers, never expecting anything in return. Yet, her kindness had left a lasting mark on the boy she had once held in her arms. And now, that boy was becoming a man with a purpose. Months later, as Barron stood at the podium to announce the launch of the Collins Foundation for Maternal Care, Margaret sat proudly in the front row. The cameras flashed, the world watched, but Barron didn't feel like a symbol anymore. He felt human. And as he spoke of his journey, of finding the woman who had been there at his first breath, he realized something profound. Sometimes, the most important journey isn't about where you're going. It's about going back to where it all began and discovering who you truly are.